She was 22 years old, and she had $19.63 to her name. And on the last cold morning of a March that had never once felt like spring, she stood at the foot of a driveway in a nowhere town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and looked at a train depot she had just been told was hers. It was the kind of building the county had already crossed off its books. The roof over the freight room had bowed inward under 60 winters of snow. The platform boards had gone soft and green. For 14 years her family had told her that the woman who once ran this place was a cold and selfish recluse who had turned her back on all of them and died with nothing. What none of them knew, what Sadie herself would not learn until the first night she slept inside those walls, and a bell she could find no rope for began to toll in the dark above her head, was that beneath the floor of that ruined little station, a woman had spent a lifetime keeping a promise no one ever asked her to keep, and that the promise was still being kept, every single night, by hands that no one in that county had ever once seen. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second to subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these quiet stories travel. Now back to Sadie. Sadie Vara came from a family that did not, as a rule, keep the people it should have kept. Her father, Jonas Vara, had been born in the iron country of the Upper Peninsula, in a mining town called Alder Bend that had already begun its long dying before he was old enough to understand it. His people were Finns who had come over 3 generations back to work the shafts, and they had carried with them the 2 things the old country had given them, which were a talent for silence and a talent for endurance, and not much talent at all for saying out loud the things that mattered most. Jonas had left the UP at 19 the way most of the young people left it, on a bus heading south with a duffel bag and a promise to himself that he would never again go down into the dark for a living. He had made good on that promise. He had learned the electrician's trade downstate, in a town outside Lansing, and he had married a woman named Colleen, who gave him a daughter in the autumn of Sadie's birth year, and then, when Sadie was 6, quietly slipped out of both their lives to follow a life she liked better somewhere in Arizona. So it had been Jonas and Sadie for a while, just the 2 of them in a small rented house with a chain-link yard, and a man who did not know how to talk to a little girl but knew how to sit beside one. He taught her to strip wire and to read a circuit and to solder a clean joint. He taught her that a thing built right did not need to announce itself, that you could tell a good weld or a good splice by how quiet it was, how it just held and asked for nothing. He was not a warm man in any way you could photograph. But there was one thing he did that Sadie carried the rest of her life. And it happened when she was 7 years old, on a night when she had gotten lost at a county fair in a crowd of strangers and had stood crying by the funnel cake stand for 20 minutes before he found her. That night, back home, he had pressed something into her coat pocket without a word. It was a small brass bell, the kind that once sat on the counter of a hotel or a shop, tarnished nearly black, no bigger than a plum. He closed her fingers around it. "If you're ever lost," he said, "you ring it, and somebody who loves you will come." She had asked him why a bell. He had only looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read, and then he had said, "Because that's how it works in our family," and he had never explained it, not once, in all the years that followed, and she had kept the bell in her coat pocket ever since without ever quite knowing why. When Sadie was 13, Jonas married a woman named Rhonda, who came into the house with 2 grown children of her own, and a way of arranging a room that left no space in it for anyone she had not personally invited. Rhonda was not cruel to Sadie in any way that would leave a mark. She was simply a woman who had decided, somewhere in the first month, that Jonas's quiet daughter was a problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved, and she managed her the way you manage a draft in a house, by closing the door on the room it came from. Rhonda's son Garrett was 26 now, a man with soft hands and a loud opinion of himself, and Rhonda's daughter had moved to Florida years ago and mostly existed as a voice on a speakerphone at holidays. The house, over the years, had rearranged itself around them until Sadie was less a member of the family than a long-term guest whose welcome everyone had silently agreed was running out. Then that January, Jonas Vara died. He was 58. It was a heart attack, sudden and total, in the front seat of his work van in a parking lot in the cold, and it took him so fast that the coffee in the cup holder was still warm when the paramedics got there. Sadie was 22, and she was working as a welder's apprentice at a fabrication shop, good with her hands, the way her father had made her, saving what little she could, still living in the back bedroom of the house, because rent downstate was a thing that ate apprentices alive. And in the space of a single afternoon, the only thread that had ever tied her to that house was cut. She should have known what would come. She did not, because grief makes you slow. The will, when it was read, left everything to Rhonda, which was legal and ordinary and exactly what wills between spouses usually do. The house was Rhonda's. The savings were Rhonda's. Sadie had no claim on any of it and had never expected one. But grief in Rhonda had curdled quickly into something else. And the something else needed a shape to pour itself into, and the shape it found was a suspicion. In the last 2 years of his life, it turned out, Jonas had made a series of withdrawals from a savings account. Small ones, steady ones, money orders mostly, adding up over time to something in the low thousands. Rhonda found the records while she was closing his accounts, and she could not account for the money, and she did what frightened people do, which was to reach for the nearest explanation that let her feel wronged instead of lost. She decided Sadie had taken it. She decided Jonas's strange, quiet daughter, the one who was always so good with locks and wires, and had all that unsupervised access to the house, had been siphoning off her husband for years. It was not true. Sadie had never touched a dollar of her father's money. But you cannot prove the absence of a theft, and Rhonda did not want proof. She wanted a reason, and within 3 weeks of the funeral, the reason had become the story the whole family told itself. Garrett said things at the kitchen table with his soft hands folded. Rhonda stopped setting a place, and on a Sunday evening in the first week of February, with the wind coming hard off the flatlands and the streetlights buzzing, Sadie came home from a closing shift to find 2 black trash bags on the front step with her clothes in them, and the front door dead-bolted, and a folded sheet of paper taped over the peephole in Rhonda's tight, angry hand. It said only that Sadie knew what she had done, that this was Rhonda's house now, and that it would be best for everyone if Sadie did not come back or call. She tried the door, she tried the side door, and the garage. All of them were locked. She stood on the step for a while in the cold with a trash bag in each hand, and she did not cry, because her father had never been a man who cried, and she had inherited his hands, and his silence, and his particular way of meeting a hard thing with a straight back. In her coat pocket, without her thinking about it, her fingers had closed around the little brass bell. She spent that first night in her car, in the fabrication shop's parking lot, and the 6 weeks after that she spent in a slow, careful slide that a lot of people never come back from. She could not make rent alone on an apprentice's wage. She could not bring herself to ask the few friends she had for more than a couple of nights on a couch, because she had watched her father go through the world asking no one for anything, and she did not know how to be the kind of person who needed carrying. So she carried herself, badly, from a couch to her car to a week, in a motel that ate a third of everything she had, and by the middle of March she was down to $19.63 and a tank of gas and the growing understanding that she was, in every way the word means, homeless. She had a trade and a strong back and 2 good hands, and none of it was enough. Because the thing that undoes you at 22 is not usually the lack of work. It is the lack of a single person in the world whose door will open when you knock. There is a particular arithmetic to being poor and alone that no one teaches you until you are living inside it. Sadie learned it that spring the way you learn a trade, by doing it wrong and then doing it a little less wrong. She learned which parking lots the police left alone and which they did not. She learned that a gym membership at $9 a month was the cheapest shower in the county, and that if you walked in at 5 in the morning with a gym bag, you looked like a person with a life instead of a person without one. She learned to make a single gas station sandwich last a day, and to take the free crackers and free coffee at the shop without anyone noticing how much of her diet they had become. She kept going to work every morning, because the work was the one thing that had not left her, and she was good at it. And there was a mercy in the way a weld does not care whether you slept in a bed. She kept herself clean, and she kept herself fed, barely, and she told no one, because telling felt like asking, and asking felt like the beginning of the end of the person her father had made her. And every night, in whatever cold place she had found to close her eyes, she reached into her coat pocket and closed her hand around the small brass bell the way a child holds the one thing that is still hers, without ever once understanding what it was for. The letter reached her the way these things sometimes do, forwarded twice, chasing an address that no longer held her, catching up to her at the fabrication shop, where she still went to work every morning with grease under her nails and a sleeping bag in her trunk. It was from a law office in Marquette, up in the Upper Peninsula, and it was thin, and she almost threw it away because she assumed it was another debt someone had found to hang on her. Instead, she opened it in the break room over a vending machine coffee, and she read it twice, and then she sat very still for a long time. It informed her that a woman named Signe Vara of Vesper Junction, Michigan, had died 2 years earlier, in the spring, at the age of 87, and that her estate, such as it was, had at last, after a long snarl in the title, cleared probate, and that Sadie Vara was named in the will as the sole heir. The estate consisted of one parcel of land, approximately 6 acres, and the structures upon it, being a former railroad depot and outbuildings on a closed branch line. The letter went out of its way, in the careful language of a lawyer who did not want to be blamed for raising anyone's hopes, to note that the property carried unpaid back taxes, that it had been assessed at a value of $0, and that the county had it scheduled for demolition. There was no money. There was only the building, and there was a single line at the bottom, added by hand beneath the lawyer's signature, that read, "She left instructions that this go to you specifically, and to no one else." Sadie knew the name Signe Vara the way you know the name of a distant weather system. She was the great-aunt, her father's aunt, his own father's older sister, the one the family spoke of, on the rare occasions they spoke of her at all, in the flat dismissive tone reserved for a relative who has embarrassed everyone by refusing to be like them. The story, as Sadie had absorbed it in fragments over the years, was that Signe had stayed behind in the dying iron country when everyone with any sense had left, that she had worked some lonely job on the railroad and lived alone her whole life, and never married, and never called, and never came to a single funeral or wedding, and that she had died with nothing because she had cared for nothing but herself. A cold woman, a selfish woman, a recluse who chose her empty depot over her own blood. For 14 years, since Sadie was a girl, that had been the whole of Signe Vara in the family's telling. And now this cold and selfish woman, who had supposedly turned her back on all of them, had reached out from beyond 2 years in the grave to leave the one worthless thing she owned to the one member of the family everyone else had thrown away. Sadie read the line again. To you specifically, and to no one else. She was 22 years old, and she had $19.63 and a tank of gas, and there was nothing at all holding her where she was. She finished her coffee. She told her foreman she needed a week, and the next morning, before the light came up, she pointed her old car north. The drive to the Upper Peninsula took the better part of 2 days, north and north again, across the great bridge at the straits where the two peninsulas nearly touch, and then up into a country that got emptier and older and more silent with every mile. The towns thinned out, the pines closed in. She drove through the last stretch in a fog that had rolled in off Lake Superior and lay in the low ground between the ridges like something waiting, and the road wound down through it, past shuttered mine heads and abandoned company houses, and the long straight scars in the forest where the railroads had been pulled up half a century ago. Alder Bend, when she reached it, was barely there anymore, a scatter of buildings around a crossroads and a gas station that closed at 6. She stopped at the township office in the next hamlet over, a small frame building beside a boarded creamery, and inside she found a woman in her 60s named Helvie Pelto, who had been the township clerk for longer than she cared to say, and who looked at Sadie for a good while before she said anything at all. "You'd be Signe's girl," Helvie said. It was not a question. "You've got the Vara look around the eyes." Sadie said she supposed she was, though she'd never met her. "No," Helvie said. "No, you wouldn't have." Signe didn't have much to do with the family down south. She poured Sadie a cup of coffee from a percolator that had clearly been on all morning, and she told her what she needed to know in the plain, unhurried way of a woman who had explained many hard things to many people across that counter. The depot was a mile and a half down the old rail bed. There was no power out there and no water except the old hand pump. The county wanted it gone, had wanted it gone for years, but there'd been some tangle in the title that kept them from taking it, and now with Signe's past, it would fall to Sadie, either to pay the back taxes and save it, or to let it go under the wrecking ball come summer. Helvey said all of this evenly, and then she paused, and she said one more thing, more quietly. There's some folks around here who'd tell you that depot's got a story on it. You'll hear it soon enough if you stay. I'd not put much stock in the ghost part, but I'd not laugh at it either. Sadie asked what she meant. Helvey only refilled her cup and said, "Go on out and see it. My cousin's boy can run you down the railbed in his truck, and you'll want to be back before dark your first night, if you take my meaning." The depot stood in a clearing where the old railbed widened into what had once been the Vesper Junction passing siding, and the first sight of it stopped Sadie in the doorway of the truck. It was a real station, unmistakably, the kind of building a child could draw and you would know at once what it was. It had a long low body of board and batten siding that had faded from red to the color of dried blood, and a steep shingled roof with wide overhanging eaves that ran the length of the platform, and out of the center of that roof rose a small square cupola, a little bell tower, with louvered sides and a peaked cap. On the track side, a bay window jutted out toward where the rails had once been, the ticket agent's window, so the agent could lean out and watch for the smoke of a train coming up the grade. Above the bay window, on a green board gone gray with weather, the original sign still read in faded gold letters, Vesper JCT. And out beyond the rotting platform, standing alone and impossible in the fog where the track had been torn up 60 years before, was a tall iron post with a movable arm near the top of it, a railroad semaphore signal, the old kind that dropped its arm to tell an engineer the line ahead was clear. The boy left her the key and drove off, and Sadie stood alone in the clearing with the fog and the ruined station, and the long, empty railbed running away into the trees, and the silence out there was not the ordinary silence of a quiet place. It was a deep and total silence, the silence of a room that has been listening for something for a very long time. She let herself in through the waiting room door. Inside was a single long room with a plank floor worn soft by decades of feet, dark wainscoted walls, a wooden bench along one side, a black pot-bellied stove gone to rust in the corner, and at the far end, set into the wall beneath the bay window, the closed door of the ticket office. The air smelled of cold ash and old paper and the faint sweet resin of pine. It smelled, though Sadie could not have said why the thought came to her, like a place that had been kept. She crossed the long room and opened the door of the ticket office and stood in it. It was a small square space, no more than 6 feet on a side, with a high slanted agent's desk beneath the bay window and a tall stool behind it, and a wall of pigeonholes gone soft with damp. A chalkboard hung on one wall for writing the arrivals and departures, and though 60 years had nearly erased it, Sadie could still make out, ghosted in the faintest white, the last thing anyone had ever chalked there. 11:52, eastbound final. She did not know yet what those numbers would come to mean to her, that she would climb a ladder and ring a bell at that exact minute for the rest of her life. She only stood in the small cold room and looked out through the wavering old glass at the empty railbed running away into the fog, and she thought of her father who had been silent like this, and of the aunt she had never met, who had sat on a stool exactly like this one, and watched a line exactly like this one go quiet. And she felt the strangest and most unreasonable sense that she had, without meaning to, come home. She spent that first day, walking the property in the gray light, and making a list in a pocket notebook the way her father had taught her, everything that was broken and everything that could be saved, and she found more that could be saved than she'd expected. The frame was sound. The well ran clear and cold and tasted of iron and stone. Somebody, at some point not so very long ago, had swept the waiting room floor and laid a fire in the stove and left a stack of split wood by the door, and Sadie noted this and did not yet let herself understand it. By any measure the county used, the place was worth exactly what the letter had said it was worth, which was nothing. The roof over the freight room would cost more to make right than the whole parcel would ever fetch. There was no power, and no plumbing, and no road that a reasonable person would call a road, only a mile and a half of old railbed. You reached on foot, or in somebody's truck. The nearest steady work was 40 minutes away, and the nearest town was already 3/4 dead. A sensible person, a person with options, would have paid the lawyer's small fee to sign thing away and driven back south, and never thought of it again. Sadie stood in the middle of the ruined waiting room, with her notebook and her list of everything broken, and she did the sensible math twice, and both times it came out the same, and both times she set it aside, was because the sensible math did not account for the one thing that mattered to her that afternoon, which was that, for the first time in 3 walls that were, however, uselessly hers, and no one alive could put her out of the hers. And no one alive could put her out of them. She walked the old railbed that afternoon, out past the platform to where the semaphore stood, and the walking of it did something to her she had not expected. The bed ran straight and level through the trees for as far as she could see, a raised grade of cinder and gravel, with the ties long gone and the rails long pulled, and the maples had begun to close over it from both sides so that it ran like a green tunnel into the fog. Her boots crunched on the old ballast. The air smelled of wet leaf mold and cedar and cold water, and under it, faint and constant, the mineral tang of iron that was in everything up here. In the soil and the well and the very blood of the place. Somewhere off through the trees she could hear a river she could not see, a low steady rushing that never once stopped. She stood at the base of the tall iron signal post and looked up at the rusted arm held straight out against the gray sky. And she did not know yet what it meant, or that a hand would drop it in the night, but she felt, standing there, the strange certainty that the depot behind her was not as empty as it looked. A thing that is truly abandoned has a particular deadness to it. This place did not have that deadness. This place felt occupied. She told herself it was only the swept floor and the stacked wood working on her nerves, and she walked back toward the station in the failing light, and she was wrong, and she was right. As the light began to fail, she made a nest for herself out of her sleeping bag on the wooden bench. Because Helvy's warning notwithstanding, she had nowhere else to be, and $19 to her name, and she lay in the dark and listened to the fog move against the windows, and told herself the small dry facts of her situation, the way you tell yourself the time. And she must have slept, because she came awake all at once, sitting straight up in the dark with her heart going hard, at the sound of a bell. It came from directly above her, a single deep bronze note, unhurried, deliberate, tolling out from the cupola on the roof, one stroke and then a pause, and then the long, slow dying of it into the fog. She sat rigid on the bench. She was not by nature a person who believed in things that could not be measured or welded or wired. But there is no power in that building, she thought, and no rope I saw, and no living soul out here for 1.5 miles in any direction, and something just rang that bell. She fumbled for her flashlight, and as she did, she looked toward the bay window at the far end of the room, and she went cold all the way through, because there was a figure standing in it. A shape, dim and gray, motionless in the ticket office window, looking out at the empty railbed. Then she got the flashlight on and swung it up, and the shape was gone, and the room was empty, and the last of the bell was still fading in the air above her head. She did not sleep again that night. She sat with her back to the wall, and the flashlight in her fist, until the fog began to gray toward morning, and then she went outside into the wet, cold dawn and made herself walk all the way around the building, looking. And on the track side, at the base of the tall iron semaphore post out in the railbed, she found the answer to at least one of her questions. It made the back of her neck prickle worse than the bell had. The semaphore arm, which had been rusted straight out horizontal when she arrived the day before. The position that told an engineer to stop was now dropped down at an angle. Clear, lines open. Come ahead. Somebody in the night, in the fog, while she sat awake with a flashlight 30 feet away, had come out here and worked a 60-year-old signal by hand, and she had heard nothing at all. The second night she did not run and she did not sleep. She was her father's daughter, and Avara does not flee a thing she can examine, so she spent the daylight hours of that second day doing what her hands knew how to do, which was to trace a problem back to its source. She climbed the ladder into the cupola and found the bell, a real railroad bell of cast bronze gone green with verdigris, and she found the rope that hung from it, an ordinary length of hemp, frayed and gray, running down through a hole in the ceiling into the freight room, where anyone standing on the floor could reach it. She found the semaphore's linkage too, a run of old rod and cable from the base of the post that a strong hand could still work if it knew where to pull. There was no ghost in the machinery. There was only machinery, kept in working order by someone, waiting for a hand. And that was somehow worse and better both at once, because it meant that whatever rang that bell at 11:52 was not a spirit but a person, a living person who came in the deep of the night, who had swept her floor and stacked her wood and worked her signal, who had been inside this building with her, close, while she slept. She sat up that second night with the stove lit and the ladder in front of her and the flashlight in her lap, and she waited, and nothing came, and near dawn she understood that whoever it was had seen her light and stayed away. So on the third night, she left the lantern dark, and she made herself as still as her father had taught her to be. When a thing was worth the waiting, she found him on that third night, and it did not happen the way fear had taught her to expect. She had wedged herself into the corner of the freight room by the ladder that ran up into the cupola, and a little after 11:30 she heard, over the sound of her own breathing, the softest possible sound of a footstep on the platform outside. Not a ghost footstep, a boot. She waited. The waiting room door eased open. A young man came in out of the fog, moving through the dark with the total unhesitating confidence of someone who has walked a room 10,000 times, and he crossed to the ladder and started up it toward the bell, and Sadie turned on her flashlight and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, "Hold it right there." He did not startle. He did not turn. He simply stopped on the ladder, one hand on a rung, his back to her, and stood there with his shoulders very still, and it was the wrongness of that stillness, the total absence of the flinch that a caught person makes, that told Sadie what she was looking at before she understood it. She moved around to where the flashlight fell on his face, and she saw a young man of perhaps 20, lean and weathered, with pale eyes and a wool cap, looking at her with an expression that was not guilt and was not fear but was instead a kind of grave and patient waiting, and when she said, "Who are you?" he did not answer, and when she said it again, louder, he did not answer, and only then, slowly, did she understand. He was watching her mouth. He tapped his own ear once and shook his head. He could not hear her at all. He had never heard the bell he rang. His name, she would learn, was Toivo, and he was deaf, and he had been ringing the bell of the Vesper Junction Depot at 11:52 every night for the better part of 2 years, ever since the old woman who raised him had died. He carried a stub of pencil and a little water-stained notebook, and it was through the notebook, back inside, by the light of Sadie's lantern, with the stove finally lit between them, that the two of them slowly began to speak. He wrote in a careful, cramped hand, and she wrote back, and the story came out of him in pieces over the long, cold hours of that night. And, by the end of it, Sadie understood that the ghost of Vesper's Junction was a 19-year-old boy who had never once in his life meant to frighten a soul. He had been 8 when Sinye took him in. His people had been drifters, the kind that the UP still pulls in and swallows, people passing through on the dead of winter with nothing, and they had left him behind. Whether by accident or on purpose he had never known, in the waiting room of a closed depot in a storm, because it was warm and because a light was on. And a woman had been in that depot, an old woman who ran a place with no trains and kept a fire going anyway. She had fed him, and she had not called anyone, and she had not asked him a single question he did not want to answer. And when the storm cleared and no one came back for him, she had simply, quietly kept him, the way she kept the fire and the well and the bell, because keeping things was what she did. She had learned to sign for him, an old woman in her 70s, teaching herself a new language out of a library book so that a deaf child would not have to grow up in silence. And she had taught him the one duty she held above all others. The thing she said was the whole reason the depot still stood. Every night she told him, no matter the weather, you ring the bell at the time of the last train, and you drop the signal to clear, so that anyone out there in the dark who is lost and cold and has nowhere to go will know that this is a place where the line is always open, and where someone will always come. Ring them home, she had signed to him. That was the whole of it, ring them home. He did not fully understand it. He wrote to Sadie, not the deepest part of it, not why an old woman in an empty station in an empty country would ring a bell every night for people who almost never came. But she had asked him to, and she had given him everything. And so when she died he had gone on doing it, alone, for 2 years, because it was the last thing she had asked and the only way he knew to keep her. He slept in the freight room, he kept the fire. He worked odd jobs in Alder Bend for cash and food. And every night at 11:52 he climbed the ladder in the dark and rang the bell for the lost. And every morning he set the signal back to stop, and the people of the county who saw the light and heard the bell and never once saw the boy had built, over 2 years, a ghost. They sat together until the fog grayed toward morning, the deaf boy and the homeless girl, passing the little notebook back and forth across the lantern light, and something in Sadie that had been clenched tight since a cold February step began, very slowly, to loosen. She asked him about the old woman, and he wrote pages. Singh had been strict and dry and about as sentimental as a length of rail, he told her, and she had also been the only person who had ever chosen to keep him, and he had loved her the way you love the one who did not leave. She had made him do his lessons. She had made him learn the bell and the signal until he could do them blind, which in the dark he essentially was. She had told him, near the end, when she knew she was going, that a day would come when someone of her own blood would find the depot, and that when they did, he was to show them the panel in the wall, and then it would be theirs to carry. He had waited 2 years, ringing the bell alone, watching the empty railbed, half believing the old woman had been wrong, that no one would ever come. And then a girl had walked in with a duffel bag, and her father's silence, and a small brass bell in her coat pocket, and Toivo had known, the first time he watched her work the stubborn latch on the freight door, without being shown how, that the waiting was over. He wrote that last part and turned the notebook around and watched her read it, and he did not smile, exactly, but something in his face eased, the way a held breath eases, and Sadie felt the same thing happen somewhere behind her own ribs. If you're still with me, take a moment to subscribe, because the next part is the part that changes everything, and it's the part they never see coming. And tell me in the comments, what is the kindest thing a near stranger ever did for you when you had nothing? I read every one. The register Sadie found 4 days later, and she found it because Toivo showed her where it was. She had been asking him, through the notebook, about the woman, about Singye, trying to square the cold, selfish recluse of the family's telling with the woman who had taught herself sign language for an abandoned child. And Toivo had listened, reading her hand, and then he had stood up and gone to the ticket office and knelt down beside the tall agent's desk and pressed his palm flat against a section of the wainscoting below the pigeonholes, and a panel of it, cut so clean along the grain that Sadie had run her hand over it twice and never felt the seam swung open on a hidden hinge. Behind it was a shallow cavity in the wall, and in the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. It was a ledger, a great heavy thing bound in marbled board and black cloth, the kind a railroad agent might once have used to record freight, and its spine was cracked and its pages were soft with handling. Sadie carried it to the bench by the stove and opened it, and Toivo lit the lantern, and for a long time neither of them did anything but turn the pages. It was not freight, it was people. The first entry was dated in the autumn of 1971 in a firm upright hand, and it read, "Line closed today. Last train, the 11:52, ran east and did not come back. Rails to be pulled in the spring. They have offered me a transfer to Marquette. I have declined it. Someone must keep the junction." And beneath that, a week later, the first name, a man's name and a date and 3 words, gave him supper. And then another, further down. A family, 4 of them, coming down the deadline on foot in the first snow, out of the mines that had just laid off 200 men in a single week. Fed them, the entry read. Bus fare to Escanaba for the father to find work. Rung home and on, page after page after page, more than 40 years of them. Sadie understood it slowly, the way you understand cold water, from the edges in. Singye Vara had stayed at that closed depot in 1971, alone at 40 years old, and she had turned a dead railroad station into something the railroad had never intended it to be. She had kept the fire lit and the well clear and the door unlocked, and she had rung a bell every night at the hour of the last train, and she had let it be known in the wordless underground way that such things become known among people who have nothing, that at the old junction on the dead line there was warmth and food and a bed and, above all, no questions. In a country that was dying, in a place where the mines closed and the men went idle, and the young people fled, and the ones who stayed sometimes ended up walking the railbeds in winter with everything they owned on their backs, an old woman with an agent's pension and a garden and a will of iron, had appointed herself, without title or salary or thanks, the keeper of the lost. And she had written every one of them down, not to keep score. Sadie understood that too, eventually, from the tone of the entries, which never once boasted and never once complained. She had written them down so that they would be a record, so that there would be, somewhere in the world, a book that said these people existed and mattered and were helped, even if no one else ever knew. The laid-off miners, the runaways, The veterans who came back from wars unable to fit back into rooms with other people. A woman fleeing a husband 3 times over 3 winters, with a different child each time. A boy of 16 who had aged out of the foster system with a garbage bag of clothes, whom Singhae had housed for a full year while he finished school by correspondence. Names Sadie did not know, and a few she would come to know. And beside many of the entries, in the same firm hand, that same phrase, over and over, like a liturgy, rung home. Rung home. Rung home. There were entries that were only a line and entries that ran half a page. A pair of brothers in 1979 who had walked 40 miles down the railbed after their mother died, and their father drank the house out from under them, whom Singye had fed for a week, and then driven, in a borrowed truck, to an uncle in Ironwood, who did not yet know he was about to become a father to 2 boys. A young woman in 1986, 8 months along and blue with cold, whom Singye had kept for the winter and delivered in the freight room by lantern light, when the baby came early in a storm and the roads were all closed, and the entry for that night was longer than any other in the book and ended with a single word underlined twice. Alive. A man in the 90s, a veteran, who had come 3 winters running and each time stayed a few weeks and then vanished, whom Singye never pressed and never turned away, and beside his last entry she had written only, "He did not come this year. I hope he found a warmer door." There were children's names and old men's names, and there were names in a hand that was not Singye's own, where she had let a guest sign the book for himself. And running through all of it, year after year, the fire kept and the well kept and the bell kept, was the plain, unboastful record of one woman deciding over and over, 40-odd years of nights, that no one who came to her door in the dark would be turned back out into it. Sadie was most of the way through the ledger, deep into the years, her eyes burning in the lantern light, and Toivo asleep sitting up beside the stove, when she turned a page and saw a set of initials that stopped her heart. The entries had changed, somewhere in the last 15 years or so. They were still names and dates and kindnesses, but a new thread had begun to run through them, and the thread was money. A money order received, $300 from JV wintercoats bought for the depot, from JV a furnace repair, a load of firewood, a bus ticket for a family Singye had never even met, wired down from a stranger who had heard somehow what the old woman was doing and who wanted to help and who signed himself only with 2 initials. JV'd appeared a dozen times, 24, steady quiet over years, and near the end, in an entry from the last full year of Signe's life, the old woman had written a longer note, the only truly personal thing in 400 pages, and it read, "My nephew Jonas sends money still, every month, and asks that no one be told, least of all his own family. He says his wife would not understand it, and that his daughter is too young to burden with it, and that when the time is right he means to bring the girl up here himself and show her what we do, so that she might carry it after us. He is a good man, though a silent one, as the men of this family always are. I keep his secret. But I keep his name here too, so that it will not be lost." Sadie sat very still in the lantern light with the ledger open on her knees. JV Jonas Vara, her father, the withdrawals, the money orders, the low thousands that had vanished from a savings account over the last years of his life, the money that had gotten her thrown out onto a cold front step with 2 trash bags and a note, the money everyone was so certain she had stolen. He had not been robbed, and he had not been robbing anyone. He had been sending it here. To a dead depot on a dead line, to an old aunt everyone else in the family had written off, to a bell that rang every night for the lost. The silent man who did not know how to say a warm thing out loud had spent the last years of his life quietly funding the kindest thing his family had ever done, and he had died before he could tell his daughter why, and the not telling had cost her everything. And it had also, Sadie understood now with a strange fierce ache behind her ribs, given her the only true inheritance she would ever receive. He had meant to bring her here. He had meant to show her. He had run out of time, and Singye, at the very end, past 90 and dying alone, had reached down through the whole wreckage of that broken family and picked the one person her nephew had wanted her to have, and she had left the bell to her. If you're ever lost, her father had said, on a night when she was 7 years old and crying by a funnel cake stand, you ring it, and somebody who loves you will come. She understood the bell now. She took it out of her coat pocket and held it in her palm, the small tarnished thing she had carried for 15 years without knowing, and she understood at last that it had never been a toy or a comfort. It had been a message she was too young to read. It was from Signe. Her father had given his daughter a bell, because in this family, the whole broken, silent, enduring line of them, a bell was how you told someone they were not alone. And she sat there in the cold with the ledger and the bell and the sleeping boy, and for the first time since the cold February night on the front step, Sadie Vara put her face in her hands and wept, not for what she had lost, but for what had been true all along, and she had not known. There was one more thing, and it was Toivo who gave it to her, a few nights later, when she had learned enough of his language to ask the right question. After Signe died, he signed the depot should have gone cold and been lost. There was no pension anymore, no garden, nothing coming in. But money had kept coming. Cash in plain envelopes, no name, no letter, arriving every few weeks, the old post box in Alder Bend that Signe had kept for 40 years, just enough to feed him and keep the stove and wood and hold the small necessary things together through the long tangle of the probate. He had assumed it was some arrangement the old woman had made before she went, some last quiet machine she had set running so the fire would not go out. He had never known who sent it. Sadie knew. She recognized the exact shape of the silence it came wrapped in because she had grown up inside that silence. Her father had kept his aunt's fire burning for 2 years, after the aunt was gone, faithfully, anonymously, waiting for the day he would finally drive his daughter north and show her what their family was for. And he had died in the front seat of a work van with the money order book still in the glove box, and that day still not come. In the days after, she found herself reassembling her father out of the pieces the ledger had handed her, seeing the whole silent man again in a new and truer light, the withdrawals she had been accused of stealing. The months he had come home tired and far away, and she had thought he was angry with her, when he had only, she understood now, been carrying a thing he did not know how to set down. The one time, years ago, that he had started to tell her something at the kitchen table. "I've got family up north you've never met." And Rhonda had come into the room with a basket of laundry, and he had stopped and never once picked it up again. He had been trying to bring her here. He had been saving it, the whole of it, the aunt and the bell and the ledger and the meaning of the brass thing in her coat pocket, saving it for a day when she was old enough and he was ready, and he had died in the front seat of a work van with the coffee still warm and that day still unarrived. It was the great grief of Sadie's life that he had run out of time. But it was the strange gift of it, too. Because a silent man who cannot say a thing will sometimes build it instead, and her father, unable to tell his daughter in words that she came from people who kept the lost, had simply arranged, through an old woman he trusted with the truth, for the lost keeping itself to fall into her hands. He had given her the bell when she was 7. He had given her the rest of it when he was gone. She had only needed to be homeless enough, and alone enough, and at last quiet enough to hear what it said. The people began to come not long after that, and their coming was the thing that finally made the depot real to her, that turned it from a wreck she owned into a place she belonged. It started with Helvie Pelto, the township clerk, who drove down the railbed on a Wednesday with a thermos of coffee and a covered dish, and sat with Sadie on the platform, and told her at last what she had not said that first day. She had known Singh for 40 years. Half the county had, in the way you know a thing you never speak of. Helvie's own brother had come down that dead line in the bad winter of the last big layoff, a grown man with a family and no work and no hope, and Signe had fed them and staked the brother to a fresh start, and never once let it be spoken of afterward. And Helvie had carried the debt of that quietly her whole life. That's why the county could never get clear title, she admitted. Every time it came up before the board, somebody who owed her would find a reason to table it. We were protecting her. We didn't none of us know how to say why. They came after that in ones and twos down the old railbed when word got around the thin scattered country that Singh's grandniece was staying on. A man in his 60s named Sully Ratio, who had been one of the laid-off miners in the ledger's early pages, and who wept openly on the platform to see the place again and told Sadie that he had gone on to 30 years of steady work downstate and put 2 kids through college and that none of it, not one day of it, would have happened if had been raised to think of as a crazy hermit. Had an ats when he would fed him and put him on a bus when he was ready to lie down in the snow and quit. A woman named Ellen Corpy, a nurse now, silver-haired and calm, who had been the 16-year-old runaway Signe housed for a year, and who had driven 3 hours to stand in the waiting room and touch the cold iron of the stove. They came and they told their stories, and every story was the same story, which was that in the worst hour of their lives a bell had rung on a dead line, and they had followed the sound of it out of the dark, and it had saved them. And Sadie wrote each of them into the notebook she carried, the way Singye had written them into the ledger, so that they would not be lost. One of them Sadie would remember above the others. He came late on a raw evening near the end of that first month, an old man on foot down the railbed with a cane and a canvas coat, and he would not come inside at first but stood at the edge of the platform in the dark until she went out to him. His name was Werner, he said, and he had ridden the last passenger train that ever ran on this line, the 1152 eastbound, in the autumn of 1971, when he was a young man of 19 going off to find work because the mine had closed under his father. He had meant, he said, to come back one day, and never had, the way you never do, and now he was old and his people were gone, and he had read in the county paper that Singye Vara's grandniece was keeping the depot, and he had wanted, before he died, to stand once more on the platform where his whole life had turned. Sadie brought him a chair and a cup of coffee, and he sat on the rebuilt boards in the cold and told her he still remembered the station agent. From that last night, a young woman then, who had leaned out of the bay window as the train pulled away, and lifted her hand to the boys who were leaving, every one of them, as if she were memorizing their faces. He had never forgotten it. He had carried the memory of that raised hand for 50 years, without quite knowing why it mattered. And Sadie, listening, understood that Singye had been keeping the lost even then, on the very last night the trains ran, before she had a ledger, or a bell, or a single soul to know it, that the keeping had been in her from the start, and that some people are simply born already holding the door. By then the depot had quietly become, without anyone declaring it so, a place again. Sadie kept a kettle hot on the pot-bellied stove, and a stack of mismatched mugs on the bay window shelf, the way Singye had kept them, because coffee is a small kindness, and a small kindness on a cold morning is sometimes the whole difference between a good day and a hard one. Walkers came down the old railbed, more of them than she would have guessed, hikers and rail fans and the occasional lost soul, and any of them could come in out of the weather and sit by the fire and have a cup, and Sadie never charged. People left things instead, a jar of honey, a loaf of bread, a folded bill and a tin she set on the bench. She did not think of it as a business, and it was not one. She thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as keeping the hour. She had begun without quite deciding to stay. She paid the back taxes out of the little that was left to her, and it was not much, because Singye had never hoarded a dime, but the county, faced now with a living air, and a building full of people who had suddenly remembered how much they owed it, found itself in no hurry at all to send the wrecking crew. Sully Rauchio came back with 2 other men and reframed the freight room roof over a weekend, and would not take a cent. Ellen Corpy's husband, an electrician, ran a proper line out from the road so that the depot had light for the first time since 1971. Sadie herself, with her welder's hands and her father's patience, rebuilt the platform board by board, and reglazed the bay window and cleaned the flue of the pot-bellied stove until it drew clean and hot. And Toivo showed her, night after night, how to climb the ladder in the dark and ring the bell at the hour of the last train, and how to drop the semaphore to clear, and she learned it the way you learn a prayer, until she could do it in her sleep. Ring them home. The signing came slower to her than the shingling did. Toivo taught her the way Singye had taught him, out of the same dog-eared library book, which Sadie found on a shelf in the freight room, with an old woman's pencil notes crowding the margins, and out of long patient evenings by the stove. She was clumsy at it, and he corrected her without mercy in the gentle way of a person who has decided you are worth the trouble, and they laughed at her mistakes. Or he laughed silently, his whole weathered face doing the work of it, and she found liked making him do that more than almost anything she had done in years. She learned the sign for bell first, and then for fire, and then for stay. And then, one evening, he taught her a sign that was in no book, a small closing motion of the hand near the heart that Sing had made up herself and used to mean rung home. And when he showed it to her, his hands were slow and careful, as if he were handing across a thing that could break. Sadie practiced it until it was hers. It was the first word in any language she had learned in years that named something she actually believed in. And after that, late at night, climbing down from the cupola with the last of the bell, still humming in the dark, the two of them would make that sign to each other. A small motion neither of them could have heard even if it made a sound, and it meant good night, and it meant we did the thing again, and it meant you are not alone out here, and none of it needed saying aloud. The trouble came, as trouble does, in a clean car on a dry afternoon, at just about the moment the place had started to feel like something worth taking. His name was Curtis Brannock, and he was a land agent, and he drove down the railbed in a spotless silver SUV that had never in its life carried a load of firewood. And he got out in a jacket that cost more than Sadie made in a month, and looked at the rebuilt depot with the pleased proprietary eye of a man appraising something he has already decided to own. He had a folder. He always had a folder, men like him. He told Sadie, warmly, that he represented a development group with a real vision for this whole stretch of river valley and dead rail line, that the old railbed made a natural corridor for a recreational trail and a lodge, that the 6 acres where the depot sat, with its river frontage and its quiet, had genuine potential, and that his group was prepared to be very generous with someone who was clearly, he could see, going through a hard patch. Lee Dennis, he named a number, $42,500, for the 6 acres and the building cash, quick close. For a woman who had 3 months before been sleeping in a car with $19 to her name, it was not a number. It was a different life. He watched her face while she took it in, and he smiled because he had watched a great many faces take in a number like that, and he knew exactly what it did to people who had never had anything. Then he made his mistake, which men like Curtis Brannock always make, because they cannot help it. Because it is the same flaw that makes them good at their work. He got greedy with his certainty. When Sadie did not immediately fall on the offer, he leaned in and let the warmth cool a few degrees, and explained to her, kindly, the way you explain a hard fact to a child, that she really ought to take it, because one way or another the property was going to change hands. The back taxes, the demolition order, the clouded title, the sheer impossibility of one young woman with no money holding an unimproved parcel on a dead line against a group with lawyers. All of it, he laid it out for her like a hand of cards, and the message underneath the kindness was as old as greed itself. You are alone and you are poor and you cannot fight us, so be smart and take the money while it's here. He was so sure. That was the thing Sadie would remember. He was so completely sure that a place with no value on the county's books, kept by a dead woman and a deaf boy and a homeless girl, could not possibly be defended. That night Sadie sat alone in the ticket office, with Brannock's card on the desk in front of her, and she let herself, for one honest hour, think about the money. $42,500. She made herself say the number out loud in the empty room, because she had learned a long time ago that the things you will not say out loud are the things that end up owning you. $42,500 was a deposit on an apartment with a door that locked from the inside, and a bed that was hers, and a lease with her own name on it. It was a reliable car that would start in the cold. It was the end of gym showers at 5 in the morning and gas station sandwiches stretched thin across a whole day. It was more than any of that, the plain animal safety of a bank balance. The one thing she had not had in a single hour since a February night on a front step, the thing her whole body still leaned toward the way a cold hand leans toward a stove. She was 22, and she had been frightened and cold for a long time. And there was not a soul on earth who would have blamed her for taking it. So she sat with it. She let it be real. All of it, the safety and the warmth and the ordinary life. And then she thought about the boy asleep in the freight room who had rung a bell alone in the dark for 2 years, for people who almost never came. And she thought about a brass bell that had lived in her coat pocket for 15 years, and a book full of names in a dead woman's hand, and her own father keeping a fire lit in secret until the day it killed him. And she understood that there are some things a person can sell, and there are some things that, the moment you sell them, mean you have sold the person you were going to become. In the morning she fed Brannock's card into the stove with the kindling. She did not do it as a gesture. She just got rid of a thing she had finished thinking about, and she put the kettle on. Before I tell you how it ends, do me one favor. If this story is landing with you, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this only keep getting made when people like you stick around. Now, Curtis Brannock had done his research on the land. He had not done his research on Singyevara, and that was about to cost him everything. Sadie did not argue with him. She had inherited her father's way of meeting a hard thing, which was not with heat but with a straight back and a closed mouth. She told Curtis Brannock she would think about it, and she took his card, and she watched his silver SUV drive back up the railbed, and then she got in her own old car and drove to Marquette to the law office that had sent her the thin letter 3 months before, because there had been a second envelope. When she signed for the estate, the lawyer had given her a sealed packet of Signe's papers, and Sadie, drowning in grief and confusion at the time, had shoved it in the glove box and never opened it. Now she opened it, on the lawyer's own desk, and the two of them went through it together, page by page, and by the time they reached the bottom of it, the lawyer was smiling in the particular quiet way of a professional who has just watched a bully walk into a wall. The papers were not many, but they were the work of a lifetime. There was a deed of conservation easement, its language dense and old-fashioned, and without a single loophole, signed in Scene's firm upright hand and recorded. The county stamp said, more than 20 years before. There was a thick folder of correspondence, decades of it, letter after letter between Signe and a state historic preservation office, and then a federal one, a patient, stubborn, 3-year campaign waged entirely by mail from a depot that did not even have a telephone, all of it aimed at getting one small forgotten building recognized and protected for good. There was the will, and clipped to the will there was a single sheet in Signe's hand, undated, that the lawyer slid across the desk to Sadie without a word. It read, "Whoever keeps the bell keeps the land. The land cannot be sold or split or built on or torn down, not now and not ever. I have seen to it. Let them come with their money. There is nothing here to buy." Sadie read it twice. Across the desk the lawyer, who had settled a great many estates in his 30 years and been surprised by very few of them, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes and said, quietly, that he had never once seen a person protect a thing so completely with so little to do it with, and that whatever the family down south had believed about the woman, she had not been a fool, and she had most certainly not been cold. Signe Vara, it turned out, had spent the last decades of her life doing far more than ringing a bell. She had understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had watched every institution in her world fail and fold, that a kindness left unprotected does not survive its keeper. And so she had built, slowly and deliberately, a wall of law around her dead depot that no developer on earth could climb. Years before, she had placed the entire 6 acres under a permanent conservation easement, deeded in perpetuity to the North Country Land Conservancy, a binding legal restriction that ran with the land forever and forbade its development, its subdivision, and its commercial use for all time, no matter who owned it, no matter who wanted it. She had gotten the depot itself listed, first on the state register, and then, after a fight that had taken her 3 years and a mountain of correspondence, on the National Register of Historic Places, as one of the last intact combination depots of its kind on the old branch lines, which meant the demolition order the county had been dangling for decades had in fact been legally toothless the whole time. And she had written a will, plain and notarized and unbreakable, that left the property not simply to a person but to a purpose. To whoever should keep the bell, with Sadie named as that keeper by her own hand. Curtis Brannock's development group could have offered $425,000 instead of $42, and it would not have mattered. There was nothing to buy. There never had been. An old woman on a pension, with no power and no money and no allies but the people she had quietly saved, had reached forward across her own death and made her kindness permanent, and she had done it, with nothing but patience and a firm upright hand, and the refusal to believe that the lost did not deserve a wall built around their shelter. When Curtis Brannock came back down the railbed a week later, folder in hand, to close on a deal he was certain no poor girl could refuse, Sadie met him on the rebuilt platform with the conservation easement and the historic listing, and the will laid out on the new white oak bench in the afternoon light. She did not gloat. She had inherited too much silence for that. She simply let him read. And she watched a man who had spent his whole life pricing the world discover, slowly, page by page, that he had walked into the one place in it that could not be priced, that the worthless building on the worthless land held up by a dead woman and a deaf boy was the single most thoroughly protected 6 acres in the county, and that there was, and never would be, one thing on earth he could do about it. He left without a word. His silver SUV did not come back. And Sadie stood on the platform in the long northern light and understood that her great-aunt had won a fight she'd finished 20 years before anyone even knew it had begun. She stayed. Of course she stayed. There was never really a question of it. After the ledger, after the bell, after the initials that were her father's, after the long line of people who came down the railbed to touch a cold stove and weep, she turned the depot into what Singye had made it, and what it had always secretly been. A place on a deadline where the fire was lit and the door was open and no one was ever asked a question they did not want to answer. She took a part-time welding job at a shop in Marquette to keep herself in what little she needed, and she spent the rest of her days keeping the junction, mending what broke and splitting the wood and drawing water from the iron-tasting well. And Toivo stayed with her, the two of them speaking in the language an old woman had taught herself out of a library book. And between them they kept the bell. And people still came, not many. It is a thin and empty country and the lost do not travel in crowds. But every so often, on a hard night, someone would follow the sound of a bell down a railbed out of the dark. A laid-off man, or a runaway kid, or a veteran who could not fit back into a room. And they would find a warm room and a fed table and a bed and no questions. And in the morning Sadie would write them in the book. She had taken the great marbled ledger out from behind the wainscoting and set it on the agent's desk in the ticket office, in the open, wound and ready like a watch, and she kept it going in her own hand, name and date and kindness, rung home, the same liturgy across a new generation of pages. And on the night she finally understood that this was her life now, that she was not passing through it, but living in it. She sat down at the desk by lantern light, and turned to the first blank line after 47 years of names, and she wrote her own. Sadie Vara, keeper of the bell, in the careful hand her father had taught her. And beneath it, because it was true, because it was the only inheritance that had ever mattered, she wrote the two words that were the whole of what the family had been trying, and failing to say to each other, in their silence, across 3 broken generations. Ring them home. The first one Sadie rang home herself came in November, at the front edge of the first real snow. She heard the sound on the platform before she understood it, a small sound under the wind that was not the wind, and she opened the waiting room door to find a young woman of 19 or 20, standing in the falling snow with a backpack and a face that Sadie knew, because she had worn it herself on a front step in February with 2 trash bags in her hands. The girl had followed the bell. She had been 3 nights on the road with nowhere to go, thrown out of a house in Marquette for reasons she did not want to give, and Sadie did not ask for. And she had heard, the way the lost still somehow hear these things, that there was a place out on the dead line where they took people in and asked them nothing. Sadie brought her inside to the fire. She fed her and gave her the cot in the freight room and a wool blanket that smelled of cedar. And she asked her not one single question. And in the gray of the next morning, before the girl woke, Sadie sat down at the agent's desk and opened the great ledger to the first blank line beneath her own name, and she wrote the date, and she wrote the girl's name, and after it, in the careful slant her father had taught her, the hand his aunt had used 10,000 times before her, she wrote the 2 words that were the whole inheritance, the only fortune that entire Thailand, her, in that entire silent, enduring family lived Montim. Rung home. Then she climbed the ladder in the cold and stood a moment in the cupola with her palm flat against the cold bronze of the bell. And she thought of her father and of the aunt she had never met, and of the boy asleep below her who had kept the faith alone for 2 years in the dark, and at the hour of a train that had not run in 50 years, she pulled the rope and she rang it. That is the thing about a bell on a dead line. It does not stop being a signal just because the trains have stopped coming. It keeps the hour in its bronze. It waits in the cupola through the long winters for the hand that will pull it at 11:52, and it rings out over the fog for whoever is out there in the dark with nowhere to go, and it does not need to know their name, because it is not calling a name. It is calling anyone. It is saying, to the whole empty listening country, that the line here is open, that it has always been open, that no matter what the maps say, and no matter what the county says, and no matter what your own family has said about you, on a cold front step with your clothes in a trash bag, there is a place where you are expected, and a fire that is lit for you, and a door that no one will ever lock again. Signe Vara had rung for the lost for more than 40 years without a wage or a thank you or a single soul to know she did it, and she had built a wall of law around the doing of it. And at the end she had reached down through her own death to hand it, deliberately, to the one person her family had thrown away, because she understood something the developers and the stepmothers, and the whole grasping certain world, never will. A legacy is not the house you own or the money you leave. It is not a thing you can appraise or subdivide or price. A legacy is a bell somebody teaches you to ring, and a book with your name written down in it so you will not be lost, and the quiet, unbreakable promise, passed from a silent man to his aunt, to a boy who never heard it and a girl who almost never learned it, that, as long as one of us is still standing, the door stays open, and the line stays clear, and the lost get rung home. Sadie Vara was 22 years old and homeless, with $19.63 to her name. And a family had told her for 14 years that the woman who left her a ruined depot was cold and selfish and had died with nothing. They were wrong about all of it. Signe Vara had died the richest woman in that whole thin, dying country. She had simply kept her fortune in a form that greedy men could not see and could not take, in names in a ledger and warmth in a stove, and a bell rung faithfully every night for the lost. And she had left every cent of it to a girl who would keep it. It was the best inheritance anyone ever received. And every night now at 11:52, the hour of a last train that ran east in the autumn of 1971 and never came back, the bell of the Vesper Junction Depot still rings out over the fog. If you are ever out there in the dark, on a dead line with nowhere left to go, follow the sound of it. The door is open. It has always been open. Somebody who loves you will come. If this story moved you, share it with one person who needs to hear it tonight. And tell me in the comments, who was the Signe in your life? The quiet one who kept the door open when everyone else had locked theirs. I'll be reading. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next quiet road.